The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Young people all over the country are taking advantage of volunteer opportunities to develop leadership skills, learn the responsibilities that go with citizenship, and are having a good time in the process. Our guest today, Rich Cairn of the National Youth Leadership Council, will discuss how the Council is helping school districts and community organizations make these volunteer opportunities available for young people. Rich, glad to have you here on All About Kids today, and we're going to be talking about some of the things that young people can do to get involved in their community, and you're of course representing the National Youth Leadership Council. So why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about what that is and what you do, and then we'll really talk about some of the things the kids are doing.
Good. Well, the National Youth Leadership Council is based in Roseville here in Minnesota, and we've been around for about 10 years. And we're a nonprofit organization. And what we do is work with schools, colleges, youth agencies, basically anybody who's working with young people, to help them develop programs to get young people involved in the community. And we work to help provide curriculum materials and training to teachers and so forth, and have also gotten very involved in the policy arena to try and help support the programs that we and other people are developing in this area.
So long before there were 1,000 points of lights, Minnesota was plugging away at service projects. And you said that Minnesota has taken a leadership nationally in developing these kinds of programs.
Yeah, the kind of most recent incarnation of the youth volunteer movement or youth service movement began in the early 80s, and it was really led by college students, I think. One of the best known is Wayne Meisel, who's actually from the Twin Cities, who walked from someplace in Maine down to Washington, D.C., talking to different people on the college level, convincing them that they should get out and get involved in the community. And he was doing this in the early 80s.
And that was the time when young people weren't very involved in anything.
Right, and certainly the perception of my generation was that we were apathetic and didn't care about anything. And Wayne and I and some others said, that's not true, we care a lot, we want to do something. I came to Minnesota in the mid-80s, and in 1984 we started pulling people together to talk about national service, to talk about volunteer service.
Now, were you a student at that time, or had you graduated and were interested in making a
I was working for the National Association of Student YMCAs, which is also based in Minnesota at the university. As I say, it was really a student initiative to get out in the community and find out what was going on and learn there. While I was there, I ran into a guy named Jim Kielsmeyer, who was at the university getting high school students involved through a youth leadership camp. And I volunteered to go out and help out as a resource person for the camp. And that was the National Youth Leadership Council that I eventually ended up working for Jim. And the reason why I liked what the NYLC was doing is that there was a real multicultural community out at the camp. And one of the things that ties together all of our work is that we found that some kind of notion of service is something that every culture has as a core value. There's a man we work with in New Mexico, a Native American man, Cherokee from Oklahoma, who talks about a concept called gadugi, which would be kind of like our concept of a barn raising, or whatever it means. Everybody comes together and you work on things together. In my culture, which is white Protestant European American culture, of course, it's a notion of the golden rule, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's a notion of civic involvement and participation is very important. But in every community, every culture, it's something that's very important. And one of the things that we try and do is to help every young person to get involved, rather than to look at young people as problems, to look at unwanted teenage pregnancy, to look at crime, to look at drugs. We focus on what young people can do to make a contribution, because I don't think we're going to make it as a people unless we involve young people. We need their creativity and sense of humor and enthusiasm.
Well, and do you think that young people do have this sense that of mistrust of adults because everything they do seems to be criticized?
Oh, absolutely.
We hear about the failure of schools turning out young people who can't read, drugs, all these social problems, but yet are you finding that when kids realize that there are adults out there who not only want them to volunteer but expect them to have responsible volunteer positions, that this gives these kids a sense of self-esteem and personal development?
Absolutely. There have been some polls done by the university, the Center for Youth Development and Research at the University of Minnesota. Diane Hedin and some others did some polls in the early 80s and found out that young people overwhelmingly thought, even more than was true, that adults had a very negative view of them. And if that's the attitude they grow up with, well, of course, they develop all kinds of problems, that they live at the level that we expect them to live to a large extent. And what those of us at the National Youth Leadership Council and the teachers and young people and principals and youth workers that we work with and represent try to reinforce is that young people can do a lot, they can contribute a lot. There's young people in Blooming Prairie, Minnesota, and a couple of other communities who serve on volunteer ambulance crews. There's a video was made by some students at Hopkins High School called All the Difference, where they went out and they interviewed these kids. And for them, it's just a matter of fact, it's something they do as part of high school. It's like being on the football team or being in band or whatever.
And it's got that same sense of importance, too. It's not just the goodies or whatever the politically correct word for that is.
Right. And it's great. There's a girl in the video. She's a high school student who says, well, you know, in my usual classes, I study, I take the test, and then I forget everything because who cares? It doesn't matter. But in physiology class, I pay attention because I know that somebody's life may literally depend upon what I learn in this class.
And she'd be one of the ambulance volunteers.
And she's a member of the ambulance crew. If you call 911 in certain communities in Minnesota, the people who show up at your door are high school students, which would terrify some people in the abstract, and yet they're competent. They've been trained, they're certified, they have to go through training to do that.
Strong and healthy.
They're strong and healthy, and a major benefit, they're there. They're all together at one place during the day, which in this particular community, nobody else can be pulled together as fast as these high school students who are all within a few hundred yards of each other during the day.
That's a great opportunity. So do you work with students and faculty at the local level to develop the kind of program that's best for their school?
We certainly don't have, our organization doesn't operate on what I call a franchise model, which is that we have a great program here and you do a cookie cutter and you say, okay, you guys do this too. Instead, what we do is we try and help. We've got a lot of good teachers in America, and they a lot of times are kind of put in boxes, and they're forced to teach in a 50-minute period, and they're forced to teach to tests, and if we get national tests, we'll only make it worse. But what they'd like to do is to be able to make their classes relevant, immediately relevant. They'd like to be able to help their students apply what they're learning. And so what we do is we help through training and providing curriculum materials, helping those teachers get together with each other, helping young people to work to initiate programs. We help them set up programs that make sense for them, with their curriculum, with their learning goals, with the learning goals of the young people in their community, working with parents and the community to set those goals and to...
Is there ever criticism from sources in the community that would say, teach the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic? What does this have to do with graduation?
The premise that I have is that the world is getting more and more complex. We can't afford not to know what's going on in other countries anymore. We can't afford not to know what's going on with environmental issues. And we can't afford not to think that the factory model of having, ringing bells every 55 minutes and the kids get up and they move to the new spot, that doesn't work. Because what we need is young people who know how to think for themselves, who can be adaptable enough that they can change careers 3-4 times in their lives. Those are just some of the basic demographic and political and economic factors about the future that we're all going to face. And if we can help young people to learn to apply critical thinking skills, to take their math and not just learn it as a rote exercise, but to learn ways to apply that to the community, all of us are going to be better off. Let me give you an example of a program that we've been working on the elementary school level. We're also working on the high school level and college level with this, and it's a program, Adopt a River is kind of a generic name for it. The basic notion is that young people would adopt some given stretch of waterway. In Minnesota, there's some people down in Hastings. There's some high school students down in Hastings, for example, who've done this. And what they do is they take a given stretch of the river and they study the biology of the river, they study the literature of the river, they study the political and economic history that goes around that river. And that's nothing new, that's been done for a long time. And then, though, they also take responsibility for it. So they do water testing, and we're not just talking about going out and sort of, dipping up some water and then putting it under a slide in a microscope. They're trained to know what they're looking at when they do that. They're trained in measuring things like turbidity and stuff like that. And they also learn what a healthy ecosystem, what a healthy river ought to look like. So you're connecting ecology and biology and zoology. They can also be, again, reading literature about the river and connecting that, doing interdisciplinary projects there. And they do river cleanups. They may get involved in advocacy. It may not make their community very happy.
I'd imagine they'd have a real sense of protection and get into the advocacy.
There was a community in Illinois where the students got in a lot of trouble because they found out that people were dumping their septic tanks into the river, and the high school students refused to be quiet about it. Nobody wanted to talk about it because it would cost them a lot of money to do something about it. And the high school students said, no, you're poisoning the river, you're putting all this sewage in the river and it's killing it, you can't do that anymore. And so it brought out an issue, brought it to the surface, that the students were really the ones that were leading the charge on that. Recycling programs are ones that recently, in the past 5 years, young people have really been leading the charge on
very,
that.
Very young children too, even elementary school. Kids have gotten involved in that. And do you work mainly with high school students rather than going down?
No, we work K through 12. Actually, I've been spending a lot of my the last year developing a K through 8. We call service learning is a word we use to describe the service and the learning combined and really going back and forth. And we've been developing a K through 8 service learning curriculum over the past year, which we expect to publish in June of '92.
Do you find that a lot of the schools get into this because they've heard from another another school, another faculty person, how well it works with the students, and then they...
That's, of course, that's always a factor. That's probably the best way that things get disseminated. There's also been, in 1987, the Minnesota legislature passed the Youth Development Act. They've added to it ever since then, and it allows school districts to levy local monies for youth development, youth service work. And right now, in 3/4 of Minnesota school districts, there are youth service programs going on, and it says right in the legislation that they have to link that to the academic curriculum. They have to link it to learning. And then in 1990, Congress passed the National and Community Service Act, which also is service learning legislation. And they had this idea. They wanted to you asked earlier if how Minnesota's been a leader. They knew they wanted to combine school-based, community-based, full-time service corps kind of programs and college programs, and they said, wow, this is a great idea. And then Senator Durenberger said to me, he says, I think they're already doing that in Minnesota. Let me go back and talk to some of the people that I'm working with there. And so we made some comments on how they could actually do what their kind of picture was, and they said, you mean you guys are already doing all that in Minnesota?
So there was input into federal legislation at this level.
And so the National Act was actually modeled to a large extent after what's been going on in Minnesota.
So this is something that Governor Carlson in spring of '92 is focusing on too. He's developed an award.
Right. There's actually, the program began under Governor Perpich, but it's continued under Governor Carlson since '88. We've been doing a statewide youth service recognition program, which is in May, and we've had 600 kids down at the Capitol during the legislative session making noise. We had a marching band one year. They told us don't do that again. But it's an opportunity to really highlight some of the positive contributions young people make, other than not to downplay.
Well, I think everybody, the legislators and certainly people in the community, not only enjoy but are excited when they think of this kind of a movement of young people.
I think that's the thing that really energizes all of this, is that there's a lot of talk and a lot of effort going into school reform and changing the way schools educate, and the group that's been left out are the students and the teachers. And what teachers and students really care about more than anything else is making a difference. They're no different from anybody else. And it gives teachers a way to apply their own values in terms of wanting to make a difference for the environment. I mean, they don't want to teach all day and then go home and be an environmental activist at night. They want to help their students learn how they can make a difference.
Well, that's the idea of people using their expertise and teachers' expertise is teaching. So that would... Well, your promotional material is wonderful because the whole focus is on empowering young people to make decisions, to take responsibility, to generate change, and I think that's extremely exciting. You also are interested in intergenerational kinds of activities. You have older people, perhaps retired people, who act as mentors with young people. Where we tend to put our focus is on helping the young people to get out into the community, and of course the community includes their own school community. But a large part of what's going on is that it's a mutual thing. Ideally, it's not sort of paratrooping help into somebody else's community, but it's young people working with their community. So the ideal to me, our office is in the Fairview Community Center in Roseville, where there are senior citizens and there are disabled people with disabilities and there's young children. And my ideal is to see all those people working together to address needs we all face together. And so I think the best thing we can do is if we can get a mentor, older person who's kind of been there and seen a lot of things to work with younger people. In fact, we even do that with having college students work with junior high students, high school students work with younger students. There was an article in the paper not too long ago, I guess early in the spring of '92, talking about volunteer college students who happen to be minorities going into junior highs and role modeling, working, tutoring, helping these young people. Is that part of your program? I can't remember the name of the program.
There's an exciting program in Minneapolis, and it's going to be launched in St. Paul in the summer of '92 called Walkabout. A lot of people have heard of. And the idea is that all the kids in the program are the kids who are having a hard time in school. It's a program to give them some added help. And in fact, what we do is we use the leaders of the program, or the high school students and the college students, who come in to help the teachers as a teaching team. And so it's been really exciting. There was a very powerful testimony given by one young woman to the Minneapolis School Board a couple of years ago, where she said, she said, I never cared about school, but after the first week of this program in the summer, every night I went home and I cried myself to sleep because I was so anxious to do a good job because I am a teacher. And to hear this kid who had been, she barely graduated. It was only with this program that she graduated that year. She'd never cared about school before, but when she got in the role of having these little kids depend on her, and her trying to help empower those kids to go out and make a difference, she took it so seriously that by the end of the summer she really felt like, I'm a teacher. And so she turned from the sort of a classic passive model of education where you crack open a kid's head and pour in the information. She was the one who was leading the program, and the teacher then can kind of step back and get out of the kid's way and let the young people set their own learning agenda, let them really drive where the learning is going.
Do you think then that adults try to control kids too much, that we don't let them try things like this? We don't expect that they can?
Afraid of kids. If you ask
we know what
people,
they should be doing, do you think?
If you ask people, and honestly, I think the average adult in Minnesota, if they're walking down the street and there's a group of 10 kids standing on the corner, they're going to get very, very uncomfortable. They're not going to feel comfortable walking by those young people. That's terrible. What does that say about us and about our sense of our future and of who we are? That's our future. Without young people, we ain't got a future. And so it's important for us to switch that attitude around and to help see.
Well, you're switching it from the angle of the young people. What do you think we need to do to get adults to see young people in a little bit positive way? Of course, if they're involved in these service projects, that's certainly positive in the community, but what else?
Well, I think, and a couple of other things that are happening in Minnesota. The legislature required school boards to include young people either on the school board or in an advisory capacity to the school board. And a lot of communities, of course, have been doing that for a long time, but there's a lot of communities that are sort of stopping and saying, what is the role of young people in deciding their own education? I mean, they ought to be involved in determining what's going to be in the curriculum. They're the ones that are going to have to live with what they learn or don't learn the rest of their life.
Check my own community, because I've never heard a word about that.
It's, I just think that across the board, we need young people as resources, and we need what they've got to offer. And so for me, it's our lack of imagination rather than anything else that's the problem.
Bureaucracies, it's hard to deal with, and the way things have always been done. And anytime we're talking about generating change, it makes people nervous, I think, in some cases. Well, we've got a couple of minutes left. Talk about some more of the projects. I think that's one of the most interesting things. You've talked about environmental issues. You talked about the young people on the rescue squad. What are some other communities doing?
One of the best known programs in the country actually is Dan Conrad's program in Hopkins, Minnesota, and he's got high school students who are working all over the community in placements as part of his community involvement class, and they're working in nursing homes and working with people who are mentally retarded. Basically, a lot of times the young people will find an issue and they'll figure out a way to work on it that adults wouldn't think of. A lot of the best social service agencies around were started by young people who didn't know that you weren't supposed to go out and help that group of people. So in that case, it's part of a regular high school class where the students look at needs in the communities, and then they figure out where they want to go figure out what they want to do to help address that. Really anything.
So every year it could change too. Conrad students could decide something different next year and touch a different angle in the community.
Another program in Sartell, Minnesota, there's a child psychology class, which used to be, the teacher will probably be mad at me if I say this, but the program was okay. I mean, it kept going year after year, but it wasn't the most popular course in the school. And now she's having to turn away a lot of students every year because they added a major community service program as part of what the students are doing as part of child psychology. They have to volunteer with young children in order to take the course. And she said that she just never could artificially create the learning situations that they come back with and say, oh my gosh, some of the things that are going on with these kids, I don't know how they can learn anything in school. And then she's able to talk that through and say, well, okay, you've had some training and some background in this now. How do you deal with that? You know, what could we do differently to help those kids learn? What social systems are out there to support that family? So it's exciting for her as a teacher. She's totally re-energized from where she was before she started doing this kind of thing.
And I would imagine that kind of a project also gets young people thinking about possible careers.
Oh, absolutely.
Social services, the
Absolutely.
environment.
Sometimes they go and they try out a career and they say, boy, I hate this. This isn't what I want to do. But I'd rather they learned that when they were 17 years old than when they're 35.
And at least they've had the experience trying it out. So what are the plans for the future? Just more?
Actually, I think the most important thing isn't necessarily just to get more people involved as much as it is to make sure that what we do well, to make sure that we really are focusing on the needs of both the community and the young people, not to get caught up in a sense of hype about, isn't this wonderful, but to really think, how can we do it right? Because the young people are ready. If you ask them to help, they help. That's not a problem at all. And if we can make programs work, if we can make the national legislation that's being implemented right now work, for example, I don't think we're going to have to twist anybody's arm to get them to do it in the future. So it's almost in a way, even though there's an excitement that there's a lot going on right now, sometimes what we try and do at my organization is to step back a little bit and say, well, let's stop for a second and think, how can we go deep on this? Somebody once said a couple of years ago that the national service movement was a mile wide and an inch deep. And I'm afraid that's true to some extent. What we want to do is to make sure that there's some spots where it's really deep that we'll dig in and hold and not get washed away with time.
Well, given your experience, I'm sure that that's what you're going to be able to do. Thank you very much for being with us on All About Kids today.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rich Cairn, for describing so well how young people can be involved in volunteer activities. Thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency. We thank you for watching, and we hope you visit your public library often.